I'd known somebody who around where we lived here in DC who had attended this church, and when I was looking into what today's service would be, I reached out. I'm like, hey, I heard this memo, and yeah, the Reverend had released some of the details of today to the members of this church, so there's certainly a benefit. Yeah, we're about 2 layers deep at this point, so we do not have any supporters here. You can see any fencing. We do have
See, I knew you would get the answer.
Yep, you can go. Very good.
Most kids roll for now.
I get it. Yeah, I get it. I'm making sure. Special day. Special time. It's not my show, it's your show, not mine. I defer.
I know. Especially C-17s.
So they're
Hello and welcome to AP's live coverage of the inauguration of Donald Trump. I'm Meg Kennard. Joining me again here on set in AP's Washington Bureau is AP White House correspondent Sagar Meghani. Sagar, thank you as always for being here with me. Appreciate that. We will be here with you as we walk through all of today's official events. On this inauguration day, AP has live cameras positioned at every key location around Washington, capturing all of today's events. That includes inside the rotunda at the U.S. Capitol, where today's swearing in will happen due to below freezing temperatures here in Washington. But first off today on this inauguration day is a church service at St. John's Episcopal Church. That's just across Lafayette Park from the White House. And this is a location where this sort of ceremony has been tradition for inauguration days going back almost a century. So this will be the first time that we see President-elect Donald Trump before he is inaugurated for a second term in office. And it's a tradition that I was reading recently dates back to 1933 when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the first president to take part in this kind of a ceremony at St. John's Episcopal Church. You see it there in pale yellow tones with white columns across the front. And again, this is the first stop on this day. Donald Trump spent last night at Blair House. That is the traditional guest residence for presidents, and it's where the president-elect typically always stays before he is inaugurated. Donald Trump has actually been there for a couple of nights now, but tonight he will be sleeping in the White House as the newly inaugurated president for his second term. So we are watching now and waiting for Donald Trump to be exiting Blair House and heading across to St. John's Episcopal Church. I was reading some reporting about what this service is like, and I say that I had to read about it because no cameras are allowed inside. This is considered to be a private event that does take place as part of the inaugural events, but it's not something that we in the media can really get in and see. But I was reading that the priest, the rector who presides over this service, sees it as relatively informal, a lot of prayer and a time for reflection as this incoming president prepares to take office. But he will be there along with family, some close advisors, some friends, invited guests. And it's a relatively simple service, from what I understand, that relies on the Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer without a traditional homily, without a sermon, without a lot of the things that we would see in a traditional church service. This is more of a prayer service. So that's what we will be anticipating as we get forward in this schedule. I want to talk really quickly as we wait for Donald Trump to show up here at this service. Sagar, let's talk a little bit about the day. After Donald Trump goes to this service here at St. John's Episcopal, what will we be seeing next? What will be his next stop?
What we'll be seeing is some of the tradition that has surrounded the inaugurations, but again, the entire flavor of it here in Washington is so different. It is bitterly cold outside. Everything's inside, so you will not see the parade. You will not see the new president walking down Pennsylvania Avenue and then sitting in the reviewing stand.
Those iconic images that we see every inauguration.
We're used to seeing, for example, when the Carters walked that entire 3-mile route from the Capitol down to the White House and inside. Long walk, but they decided to make it. We will see Donald Trump, as you said, who is on his way to Blair House. J.D. Vance, the incoming vice president, already inside. Several members of the president's incoming administration, like Pam Bondi, who's named to be the Attorney General, Kash Patel, who he wants to head the FBI. They are already inside, and now, as we see, that is the presidential motorcade, the president-elect's motorcade. Donald Trump will be making his way inside. There'll be the church service. He will go over to the White House where he'll be greeted by the Bidens. They will have coffee and tea, and then they will make the joint ride together to the Capitol. And that is always one of the most striking symbols of the transfer of power here in America.
Let's listen in for a moment as we see President-elect Donald Trump arriving at St. John's Episcopal Church here in Washington. You're seeing now a shot of the White House here in Washington, which clearly is one of those scene setter spots for this Inauguration Day. This is where we will see Donald Trump heading next after he finishes up with the church service at St. John's Episcopal. That's what you were just looking at. But this is the White House, and this again will be his home for the next 4 years, and where the next official event in part of these inauguration festivities will include a private coffee and tea meeting between the Trumps and the Bidens. That's one of those things that we always see happen on inauguration days, and that's what's up next on the schedule. But there's a whole lot of other things that are happening around Washington too. In addition to the official inauguration inside the Capitol Rotunda, you're now seeing pictures of the Capital One Arena here in Washington. That's going to be the scene of what would have been an inaugural parade. Now is going to be an inside event featuring a lot of the same features, but before a much smaller audience. Capital One Arena has a capacity of just around 20,000 people, and that's a fraction of the potential hundreds of thousands that would have lined the streets here in Washington and been on the National Mall to watch the inauguration festivities and the parade itself. But speaking of Capital One, Sagar, let's talk a little bit about that spot. Donald Trump was just there yesterday for kind of the final rally of the 2024 campaign cycle. At least that's what it felt like to me. Talk to us a little bit about what Trump has been doing over the past couple of days and what we expect to see here at Capital One later on.
The president-elect came back to Washington, another triumphant return on Saturday, aboard a plane that looks a lot like Air Force One, but of course at the time is not Air Force One.
Remind me, what do they call it when the actual president's not on board?
Special Air Mission 47 is the designation given to the C-32 that is painted to look like Air Force One. If you go out to Joint Base Andrews, if you get to be on the tarmac, you will see a whole lot of planes that have that iconic paint scheme, that blue and white with United States of America. That does not mean they are Air Force One. It is only Air Force One once the sitting president is aboard of that aircraft. The other ones look like it. That doesn't mean anything, depending on who's on board. So the next time Donald Trump boards one, it will have that designation. So he got in from his Florida golf club. It's been a full weekend. He's had rallies, he's had dinners. He made his way to Arlington National Cemetery yesterday for a wreath laying at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And he gave a preview inside Capital One Arena, the home of the NBA's Wizards, the home of the NHL's Capitals, a lot of concerts and shows, saying tomorrow at noon, being today, curtain falls on what he called the failed Biden presidency. We're not going to waste any time. He is expected to make some remarks today before this parade. Elon Musk is expected to address the crowd as well.
We saw him there yesterday, too.
Exactly. So they had planned that rally for Sunday for quite a while. And then all of a sudden, when the news came down Friday that, hey, it's going to be really cold, we're going to move all this inside, all of a sudden, Capital One Arena became essentially ground zero for much of what we're going to see today.
Yeah, it's just been so interesting, and obviously it involved a lot of logistical changes for those of us trying to cover the inauguration, but also the thousands of folks who are here in town trying to attend all of these things. All of this due to the weather. Have you looked at a forecast? Do you know how cold it's actually supposed to be today?
They had told us somewhere in the mid-20s, but it's really windy, so the wind chill is going to be down likely in the single digits. Now, the last time this happened, an indoor swearing in, 40 years ago to the day, Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, but at the White House on January 20th of 1985, it was 7 degrees at noon. Barack Obama's first inauguration, 2009, it was, I believe, 27, 28 degrees. I was outside for hours that day. It was bitterly cold. So if you factor in today's wind chill, it's a lot worse. So that rare decision was made that the oath will be taken inside the rotunda. Roughly 600 people capacity. There were 250,000 tickets issued for people to watch the oath and the ceremony in and around the Capitol. So do the math, that's a lot of people who are not going to get anywhere near what they thought they would get today.
Absolutely. And now you're seeing a live shot of Pennsylvania Avenue, which is, of course, one of those areas where we would have anticipated to see this inaugural parade happening. There are clearly lots of people out there. We see it lined with American flags and a very festive kind of feel, which I guess kind of describes exactly what we're seeing all around Washington. Even though a lot of these events have been moved inside or changed somewhat logistically, there are still a lot of people here, and they're gathering not only at Capital One Arena, but also all across town. I think when I was walking back from the office yesterday, I just kept running into pockets of people who were clearly here for some of the festivities, and maybe were looking for somewhere to be where they could kind of gather together with more folks who were excited like they were to do all these celebratory kind of activities. But it looks like we are going to see people kind of lining up along that route where we otherwise would have seen the parade. But one thing that I did notice about the National Mall, where we always have the big screens kind of displaying everything that happens on the inauguration, that many of those had been covered, and that officials here and law enforcement have told people, please don't come outside. It's going to be too cold. It's too dangerous. We don't want you to be putting yourself at risk. Well, clearly it looks like we still are going to be seeing some people at least lining up in some of those places where they ordinarily would have been.
There are always a lot of people who come into town for this, and Trump supporters have, of course, waited for years for this moment. So you have the official inaugural balls tonight. There are 3 of them. But a lot of state societies and other organizations have had their own balls over the last year. You have the Black Tie and Boots ball put on by folks from Texas, various parties at various hotels. So those people, for the most part, you didn't think that Friday, when this change was announced, they were going to say, hey, you know what, we're just going to eat that cost of airfare and exorbitant hotel prices in D.C. and not go because it's going to be cold. Those folks wanted to be here either way. Obviously, a lot of disappointment that you might not be sitting at the West Front, or you might not be sitting in the reviewing stand if you had bought some type of VIP ticket. But there will be those 20,000 people inside Capital One Arena. They started lining up early this morning in the cold to get inside. And like you said, there's no real official viewing area for this. Those monitors are down, but that doesn't mean people can't wait for a glimpse of the presidential motorcade, and that's clearly what a lot of people expect to do today.
I guess being here in Washington and also along the campaign trail, we get so accustomed to seeing motorcades and all the trappings that come along with major candidates and also elected officials, president, vice president. But for these folks, like you note, who have been traveling here from all over the country, have been waiting for this moment, these supporters of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, this is their moment and chance to kind of be in the same space as they are and to sort of have that experience. So I guess a lot of those folks are going to figure out a way to have that today, even if it is really cold outside.
Just that thrill of seeing the presidential limousine roll by, and perhaps you can see the president sitting inside. When I first came to Washington, a friend who was a big George W. Bush fan, we happened to walk down by the White House in the early 2000s, and the motorcade came by, and you could very clearly see George W. Bush in the back seat with a smile on his face, waving to people as they drove by, and it completely made my friend's day, and all these little kids were shrieking. We get, as you said, used to it, and we get annoyed when we're stuck in traffic because a lot of streets are shut down when that thing comes through. But for someone from out of town to get to see literally 10 feet away the President of the United States waving at them, that's something special. And like you said, that's a moment a lot of people today are hoping to get here in a very, very cold Washington.
Absolutely. And we're seeing now more pictures there of St. John's Episcopal Church. That is where President-elect Donald Trump is participating in a prayer service, which is part of the tradition on Inauguration Day. Every president-elect since 1933 with Franklin Roosevelt has done that, and so he is there. He is with Melania Trump, his wife, soon to be First Lady Melania Trump again, and as you noted earlier, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance is inside, as well as Elon Musk and some other top-level supporters of President Donald Trump, soon to be president again, as he prepares to take the oath of office around noon today here in Washington for his second term in office. You're also seeing there the Capital One Arena. Again, that is where we will see the new version of the inaugural parade, not down Pennsylvania Avenue and around Washington, but instead there in the sports arena here in Washington. That's where tens of thousands of his supporters are already beginning to gather. They've been lining up since very early on today and getting ready to participate in what we know will be a very festive atmosphere. We're not exactly sure yet what it's going to look like. We know what parades look like in terms of marching bands and official shows of pageantry through the streets. We always, or at least in recent memory, we see the new president get out of that limousine to walk that final stretch back into the White House. I would imagine that we will see Donald Trump, at least his motorcade, take some of those traditional pathways around Washington as he moves from the Capitol down to Capital One Arena. And as we were just looking at Pennsylvania Avenue there with all of these folks lined up, they are hoping to get that glimpse. So we will keep track of exactly how he makes his way over to Capital One Arena, but that's where a lot of those celebrations will be. Now, let's talk a little bit about other things that we think might be happening at Capital One. We know from President-elect Donald Trump that he will be signing a lot of executive orders today. And I think we'll probably talk about those more later once we maybe get a sense of exactly what's in them. But I think a lot of the places that we're looking at there are some of the places where we think he will be signing those executive orders. It's traditionally something that the incoming president opts to do very swiftly, since taking executive action is the one thing the president can do unilaterally without Congress getting involved. But what's your sense, Sagar, of maybe how many executive orders we're going to see today and what we think we might be getting in terms of the content of what they cover?
Yeah, he being Donald Trump, has long promised, day one, I'm going to do X and Y and Z. I don't know exactly what that will be, but it's a safe bet to think he'll be signing orders about immigration, about energy policy, about scaling back the size of the federal workforce, a big thing that he's been involved with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Ordinarily, some new presidents will sign executive orders inside the Capitol before leaving for the White House, and then upon getting into the White House, because traditionally there's no stop in between those two places. Now you do have Capital One Arena. You have 20,000 people there. Not out of the realm of possibility that a desk is set up and Donald Trump, ever the showman, will sit down and pull out one of his famous Sharpies and put his name on some so people can watch him do that. We don't have a very good sense yet from the Trump people of how many that might be. Will it be a handful? Will it be dozens? We just don't know. We do know that when he sat in that same arena yesterday, he said, we're not going to waste a minute. I'm going to take some executive action that you're going to like a lot. We'll just have to see now how many of them he actually does put his name on.
I mean, I've heard everything from dozens to 100. I even saw the number 200 yesterday. But I guess for a lot of the folks who are gathered there at Capital One, getting this experience of, like we were just talking about, seeing the incoming president, and really it might be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for many of them to especially do that in Washington, to actually get to see him take some of those official actions and to enact policies, or at least on an executive level, to change the way that things are done in the United States. I mean, that would be an interesting opportunity, I guess, for somebody who's here as one of his supporters to actually see that happening.
Yeah, and we get those at the White House quite a bit, where there is a bill signing where the president will make brief remarks and then sit down at a desk surrounded by lawmakers or whomever it might be. And you get to watch them sign it, and depending on how close the microphones get, you can actually hear the pen on the paper. With Trump, you could hear it very vividly because of that thick Sharpie that
Right.
he liked to use. But again, that's a chance that some of us in the White House press pool get the opportunity to be in the room to watch that happen. You don't usually get to see that with 20,000 people in a professional sports arena who might have been there for a concert or for a game. Now get to watch the President of the United States actually put his name on some official documentation. So that would no doubt be a thrill for those folks. Again, like so many things that we remember from that first administration, we just don't know exactly what it is Donald Trump's going to do until he actually does it.
But I guess we'll be kept in suspense along with the people there in Capital One. We are still seeing pictures of the front of St. John's Episcopal Church. That, again, is where President-elect Donald Trump is participating in a morning church service before he heads over to the White House, which you also see. That, of course, will be his home for the next 4 years as President of the United States. But it's also where he will participate in a last get-together with current President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, as is tradition for outgoing and incoming presidents on Inauguration Day. So for now, we will leave you with these images, and we will be back shortly to walk through the rest of this Inauguration Day, which, as we have been noted, takes us all across Washington here in the District of Columbia and culminates back at the White House, which you see there on your screen, for the rest of then soon-to-be President Donald Trump's day in office, his first day back as President of the United States. So right now we're going to listen in to what is going on there outside St. John's Episcopal Church, and we will be back shortly to see where incoming President Donald Trump heads after this church service. You're looking now again at the door of St. John's Episcopal Church, where we have just seen Vice President-elect J.D. Vance exiting after this Inauguration Day prayer service. We expect to see President-elect Donald Trump on his way out shortly. They've been in church for about 45 minutes for this service that is part of every Inauguration Day since 1933. And we also understand that the Bidens, you see there, along with Vice President Kamala Harris and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, they have been there at the White House. The Bidens will be shortly greeting the Trumps after the Trumps exit the church service and go over to the White House for this private meeting, a coffee and tea between the incoming and outgoing presidents, another tradition that we always see on Inauguration Day, at least mostly see on Inauguration Day. We did not see that happen 4 years ago when Donald Trump was leaving the White House and Joe Biden was coming in. But we are now looking again at St. John's Episcopal Church. Again, that is where we expect any moment to see President-elect Donald Trump exiting the church, which is just across Lafayette Park from the White House here in Washington, and heading over to the White House to see Joe Biden and Jill Biden for one of their last official acts there in the White House as the President and First Lady. But notably, again, 4 years ago, this is not an exchange that we saw happen when Joe Biden was coming into the White House and Donald Trump was leaving it. We did not see the Trumps as part of that handoff of power between administrations. And so to have this moment and to have several weeks ago see that moment between Trump meeting with Joe Biden at the White House, as we typically do see after an election with an incoming and outgoing president to have their private meeting, which they did. That happened several weeks ago at the White House there in the Oval Office. But we are still watching the door of St. John's Episcopal Church, watching for Donald Trump and Melania Trump to exit this church after the service and head over to the White House to have that meeting with the President and First Lady. And then from there, all four of them will travel together over to the U.S. Capitol for the swearing in, for the inauguration ceremony of Donald Trump into his second term as president. And after that, we will see the Bidens leave Washington. We traditionally see a farewell, a formal goodbye of sorts occurring after that swearing in of the new president, where the outgoing president will bid them adieu, and then we will see the Bidens leaving Washington, heading out to Joint Base Andrews, and then onward from there to California. But now we are still looking to watch for President-elect Donald Trump coming out of the White House, or of St. John's Episcopal Church. And as this is happening, we'll just take a moment to kind of think about other things that we are learning and thinking about this first day, which will be officially a half day, but still the first official day of the second Trump administration. We have been hearing about all the executive orders that he plans to sign. We expect that to start pretty much as soon as he is sworn in, Sagar. We've been talking about how that may be happening at several different locations around Washington, from maybe there at the Capitol Rotunda to the Capital One Arena to certainly the White House and the Oval Office after the other official events of the day and when he kind of gets down to business there in the Oval Office.
Yeah, the incoming Trump team has been busy while the president-elect has been inside the church. His team has been busy briefing reporters about what is going to come, and we understand that there will be a whole series of executive actions, as we previewed a little while ago, specifically about remaking immigration policy. Mm-hmm. That's something Donald Trump has made no secret of, that day one, literally within the first hours of reassuming the office, that was going to be a priority. Unclear how that's going to play out, but that's what we're expecting.
Thank you for that. We will pause here just for a moment and listen in, because I believe that President-elect Donald Trump is going to be coming out of St. John's Episcopal Church.
President Trump! President Trump, how are you feeling today? How are you feeling, President Trump? Come talk to us, President Trump! Mr. President, how was service? Mr. President, will you talk to us? do you think about the pardons? Mr. President, any response to the pardons? Mr. President, how is this different for you from 8 years ago?
You're watching now as President-elect Donald Trump and incoming First Lady Melania Trump leave St. John's Episcopal Church. They are only on a short drive, though. They are headed to the White House, which is just across Lafayette Park from the church. When they get to the White House, they will be greeted by President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, again for the traditional changeover of sorts, a coffee and tea gathering with the outgoing and incoming president and president's spouse. So we are watching there at the White House, where we anticipate shortly we will see President-elect Donald Trump rolling up. And again, the next time that he comes back to the White House after this gathering, he will be entering it as the President of the United States, not as President-elect. So again, this is one of those moments on Inauguration Day that we typically see and watch for, but we didn't see 4 years ago when it was Donald Trump's turn to exit the White House and Joe Biden's turn to come into it. But we are back on schedule, at least in terms of some parts of this Inauguration Day. It is awfully cold, so we won't see the traditional view on the west front of the Capitol for the swearing-in ceremony. That will be happening inside the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, with a much smaller audience. Only about 600 people can fit in there, according to what organizers have told us, instead of the hundreds of thousands who perhaps would have been on the National Mall to watch the swearing in. But that will be the next stop after this one. Again, we are watching the White House here, where President-elect Donald Trump and Melania Trump will be shortly arriving for their meeting with President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden. This is a tradition on Inauguration Day. It's not one that we saw 4 years ago, but it is something that we are watching for today, for the outgoing and incoming presidents to have an informal handoff of power before they ride together to the U.S. Capitol for the formal handoff of power, for the swearing in of the new president and the farewell of the outgoing president. That's what we'll see for Joe Biden and Jill Biden after the official swearing-in ceremony, when they depart the Capitol grounds, headed for Joint Base Andrews, and then on from there to Santa Ynez, California, for some respite and time away after their time in the White House has ended. So, Sagar, we are still sitting here and watching the White House. So after this, where will we see these outgoing and incoming presidents head? Where do they go next?
They will make the traditional ride together, the outgoing president, the incoming president, on that 3-mile drive to the Capitol. Instead of taking that traditional walk down on the West Front, they'll be walking into the Capitol Rotunda for the oath. Notable that it was just 2 weeks ago that much of official Washington also gathered in the Rotunda. That's where Jimmy Carter's body was lying in state. And now 2 weeks later, the public will again be focused on what happens underneath the Capitol dome. That ride together is always fascinating. We've seen images from the early 1900s of open vehicles, and you have names like William Howard Taft and Warren Harding and others riding. And now, obviously not an open top, but you should have Joe Biden and Donald Trump riding together in a armored limousine up to the Capitol, where Donald Trump will go from being the 45th president and an ex-president to now being the 47th president.
Seeing there some of the Trump family members exiting the church, purportedly also getting ready to start making their way over to the Capitol for the swearing in, which will be happening in just over 2 hours from now. Yes, Sagar, I've often wondered on that ride between the White House and the Capitol, what is the conversation like? Obviously, these two, it would be very interesting to know, but I mean, Donald Trump's been there before. He might not have any requests for tips, which another incoming president might have.
I think the thought is, especially with this relationship and that fraught relationship Donald Trump has had publicly with his predecessors, that it would be contentious or that there would be nothing at all. But if you remember during Jimmy Carter's state funeral at the National Cathedral, Donald Trump and Barack Obama sat next to each other and were just looked like they were joking and laughing.
Lots of conversation.
And having fun. Would love to know what it is they were talking about, but they both looked very at ease and almost friendly. And we know that is not, again, at least publicly, the relationship that has been described. So is this going to be Joe Biden giving Donald Trump some final tidbits about the state of affairs? We're going to find out.
All right, we see now images of the motorcade arriving at the White House. Not a very long drive, but especially not, I guess, when you're president-elect. A lot of streets do get shut down for you. But now we see the Vice President Kamala Harris and Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff standing there to receive official guests on their last day, also as part of the outgoing Biden and Harris administration. So let's listen in for a moment.
back there for thanks, mate. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Here's a look inside the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where we are seeing some musical selections being performed. Again, that is where President-elect Donald Trump will be taking the oath of office about 2 hours from now. Inside, because it is very cold here in Washington, and official events have been moved from the west front of the Capitol to inside the Rotunda. So let's listen in to this musical performance. of the U.S. Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue. That is the traditional parade route where we would have anticipated seeing Donald Trump travel between the Capitol and the White House. He may be driving along that route, but it won't be lined with the tens of thousands of people who ordinarily would have been out there to see him make that very traditional inaugural trip. It is very cold, so officials have told people to stay inside to observe these official proceedings from elsewhere and not gather in large numbers outside. Here in Washington, it is currently about 24 degrees, and it is not anticipated to be much warmer than that at noon, which is when Donald Trump will officially be the next president of the United States. We are still waiting on the Trumps to arrive here at the White House for their tea and coffee private gathering with President Joe Biden and Jill Biden. But we will continue to watch for Donald Trump and Melania Trump to make that trip over to the White House, their last, before they officially become President and First Lady. You're looking again at the White House, where we know that President-elect Donald Trump and his wife, Melania Trump, will shortly be arriving. Again, this is when they will be having their private meeting with President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden, just the four of them, and it's part of that unofficial handover of power between an outgoing and incoming administration. It's not something that we saw happening 4 years ago when Donald Trump was leaving the White House and Joe Biden was coming into it, but it is something that we anticipate seeing today. As we wait for them to roll up, one important note to point out is we did see Vice President Kamala Harris and her husband, Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, welcome incoming Vice President J.D. Vance and his wife, Usha Vance, just moments ago when they entered the White House. And that's interesting because typically the outgoing vice president will invite the incoming vice president to get together ahead of today. We didn't see that happen between Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance, but we did in this hour just a little while ago see her welcoming him there at the White House, where purportedly they are doing something similar. They're taking a look at President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden as they await President-elect Donald Trump. There he is, coming up to greet them for this private meeting. Let's listen in as Donald Trump and Melania Trump arrive at the White House.
Ask them if they have House Triangle now on that.
You're seeing there again a shot of the White House where President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden have just welcomed the Trumps, Donald Trump and Melania Trump, in for their private gathering. On the left, though, you see the Capitol, as well as the helicopter that will take the Bidens away from Washington as the former president and former First Lady in just a couple of hours from now. And this may be a good opportunity for us, Sagar, to kind of talk a little bit about Joe Biden's final actions as president. This is the last day that he will be the current president of the United States. But it has been a pretty active day in terms of official things that he can do in the final hours of his administration. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of those things that we have seen coming out of the Biden White House in these last moments.
The thing that has gotten the most attention that happened, about two and a half hours ago now, a lot of pardons and commutations from the president in previous days. Some very big names being preemptively pardoned this morning. The president has issued pardons to Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former head of infectious disease research for the United States, General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the members of the House panel that investigated the January 6th attacks. This is after Trump had basically throughout his campaign vowed retribution against those that he perceived tried to hurt him, tried to hurt the nation. He has long gone after General Milley, whom, again, he handpicked as his senior military advisor to be in charge of America's military. Long at odds with Anthony Fauci over the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, the January 6th riot, where the president-elect has already said he wants to pardon the rioters. President Biden has now preemptively moved to shield those officials from anything that might happen. He says this is not an admission of guilt or wrongdoing or a thought that they may face prosecution, but I couldn't not do something about this. Both General Milley and Dr. Fauci have come out and said that they appreciate it, that they did not want to have to fight back against what someone, in this case Donald Trump, perceived as some type of slight. Tony Fauci flat says, I have not committed any crimes. I have spent my entire career trying to keep the American people healthy, but I appreciate the president's move. So this is something that had been discussed within the White House for months now. Is the president going to preemptively move to keep these folks out of harm's way, for lack of a better phrase? And that's exactly what he did this morning. It's an extraordinary use of presidential authority and could set the tone for Trump and others to then take actions like this immediately before they leave office.
Right. It's a large action to take, but also literally in the closing hours of an administration. I guess, I mean, there's less time for it to be analyzed while that presidency is still ongoing, because the news cycle will move on necessarily to this next administration. I'm not attempting to analyze exactly why the timing was put like that, but it is something that those of us who cover this have been wondering for a long time. Is this going to happen? And now that it finally has happened in these very closing hours.
It is customary for citizens who've been, in the president's case, convicted of drug crimes and things to receive clemency, but to do it in this kind of untested way with this type of name, Tony Fauci, Mark Milley, Benny Thompson, Liz Cheney, right down the row, incredibly unusual. And, as we talk about the peaceful transfer of power and, they smiled and shook hands at the White House, and what are they going to chat about in the limousine? This is directly from President Biden to his successor, hey, you said you're going to do this? I'm not going to let you do it. So here you go. Hours before you have the office, it's still my job. I can do whatever I want. Just pretty stark to see it come out this morning.
Certainly. And then again, that limo ride between where they are right now, you see on your screen in the White House, to where you see on the left-hand side the U.S. Capitol building. That is something I would love to be a fly on the wall just to hear what is discussed and what goes on in that conversation. You're seeing now other images of Washington. On the left-hand side, the U.S. Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue, that traditional parade route where we expect Donald Trump to be traveling, but perhaps not officially in the parade that ordinarily would take place on an inauguration. That all has been called off and rescheduled to an event you see on the right-hand side in the Capital One Arena here in Washington, where there will be, it's still being called a parade, but we're not exactly sure that it will have the same sort of format, certainly not the marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, but that's where Donald Trump will be going after he is sworn in as president here in just a few hours. And we expect also to see him sign some of those executive orders that Sagar and I have been talking about, some actions that he can take as president and has promised to do, and said right there in Capital One Arena last night that he felt his supporters would be very pleased with the type of executive orders that he would be signing today. So we will keep an eye on all of those spots, but right now, the Trumps and the Bidens continue their coffee and tea private gathering there in the White House on the upper right part of your screen.
They're using all that. Yeah, so what you do is you got a piece of tape. zip ties. Hold that there. I got actually we get it in there we go. This will be the trick. Alright, you want that coming straight out. Not like pinching off to the side or some shit like that. Okay, so you should be pretty good. You got some slack there. You're all good. Move this up close to your tubing. You can see this okay. I would have just a little bit. Huh? So I try to bring it down a little bit. Not too far down. Yeah. Good. This is good. Okay then? Good. Oh wow, no, one thing I forgot, but I got that. Okay, sounds good. Got RFK right now. Where's them? Some of these other cabinet members.
Ladies and gentlemen, former speakers of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Kevin McCarthy, the Honorable John Boehner, accompanied by Mrs. Debbie Boehner, the Honorable Newt Gingrich, accompanied by Ambassador Callista Gingrich, and Mrs. Heather Foley.
Have the arcane knowledge ready to go?
already going to go separately, but they're going to go in the door into the windows right here.
Yes.
South.
Spouses will go first. The second spouses will go
Okay,
first.
so everybody will go in right here.
Everybody's going to go, one car at a time. They'll fill up, leaves,
Okay.
next one comes up.
Okay, very good.
Not yet.
Pick it up and just put it in the bushes and take care of it. They're coming out, coming out.
We're seeing now these first images of the people leaving the White House after these private meetings. That was just Second Gentleman Doug Imhoff and Usha Vance, J.D. Vance's wife. He's the incoming vice president, of course. And they are the first to be set up in the official limousines to be departing the White House, heading over to the U.S. Capitol for the swearing-in ceremony, which will be happening in just under 2 hours from now if we're sticking to the official schedule of events here in Washington. There you see one of 4 limousines now at least that are lined up there at the portico of the White House. We'll be taking Doug Emhoff and Usha Vance off to the U.S. Capitol. They are departing now. We expect next to see Vice President Kamala Harris and the incoming Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, exiting next and getting into their limousine to be taken off to the U.S. Capitol. Of course, J.D. Vance, here in just a little over an hour and a half from now, will be the Vice President of the United States, being sworn in by Supreme Court Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of his longtime friends, as we're all reading up on history of all of the characters involved with this Inauguration Day. They've known each other since their Yale Law School days, so there's a fun fact for you. But here we're still looking at pictures of the White House where for the past little bit of time, under an hour, there's been a unofficial casual tea and coffee, off the record, at least not privy to reporters like me, but a meeting between President Joe Biden, First Lady Jill Biden, and the incoming President Donald Trump, President-elect, and Melania Trump, his wife. They have been gathering for one of these moments that we see on Inauguration days here at the White House. And soon, those two will also be getting into a car together and making that trip just a couple of miles down to the U.S. Capitol, where the rest of the official swearing in for Donald Trump's inauguration will be happening on this Monday, January 20th, here in Washington, D.C. So we're looking at those doors, waiting to see who is coming out next. Sagar, we can spend this moment, I guess, just to kind of talk a little bit about this last day in office for the Bidens, not just as an administration, but as a family. They have been living in the White House for 4 years. And once they leave here in just a few minutes, that move-out process really kicks in to do that turnover in between administrations. There's really only about 5 or 6 hours to get it all done. What all is going to be happening once they exit those doors?
Yeah, it is a fascinating choreography that takes place right now at the White House. We're looking at the North Portico. Well, they arrived and they'll be leaving. On the other side of the White House, there are moving trucks lined up that will be waved in the instant that the Bidens and the Trumps leave. One group will be moving all the Biden stuff out. One group will be moving all the Trump stuff in. In between, stripping all the beds, shampooing the carpets, replacing what needs to be replaced. Linens, towels, whatever it might be. Closets stocked. The White House usher's office would have been in touch with the Trumps for the last few months about where certain things go, what are the favorite foods and snacks that we need to have in the various kitchens, in the residence, and elsewhere. We know all about Donald Trump and his penchant for Diet Cokes. You can rest assured that there is a lot of Diet Coke on hand, at least on the White House driveway right now. So, yeah, they've got about 4 or 5 hours of controlled chaos, as one former White House official put it, to get all the old First Family stuff out and make sure that when the new First Family comes in, they're good to go. They're not having to root through boxes like the rest of us when we move into a new place and, you know, where is that stuff for the kitchen, or where did we put the bike pump, whatever it is. That's all laid out in the mansion. Donald Trump's not going to have to be looking for any of that.
Yeah, moving day is always a stressful time. Try not to think about that, because it's just, you're living in those boxes for months, but not when you're living in the White House, because there are plenty of folks to take care of that.
And then there's the personal part of just leaving where you've lived for 4 years, a place that in Joe Biden's case, he tried so hard for so long to get into, and now has to leave 4 years later. And on his, perhaps his final tweet under the @POTUS account on X, it's a selfie with the president and the first lady with a snow-covered rose garden behind them in the Oval Office just on the other side. One more selfie for the road. We love you, America. So you can almost picture them stepping out onto the colonnade on this horribly cold DC day to say, hey, let's take a quick selfie. I mean, I've done that, walking along that when we're, out covering White House events. But for the President and First Lady to get to do that one last time, because as you said, when those doors open again and they walk out, that's it. They're boarding what would be known as Marine One and heading out. And that is the end of the Biden presidency.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to think about, what you were just mentioning about that personal side of things. What we're watching are all of these official events, and what we know always is part of the TikTok of a day, like Inauguration Day. There are set pieces. There are even specific times assigned to a lot of this, especially that noontime when it is according to the way that things are set out. It's not just we picked this time. It's like that is the official time. Now we're seeing those doors at the north portico of the White House open again. We see First Lady Jill Biden and incoming First Lady Melania Trump exiting and getting into their own limousine, where they will be taken over to the U.S. Capitol. As we think about these situations, Sagar, we have talked a little bit about the outgoing president and the incoming president and kind of what they might share in casual conversation. But this is also a first lady who's been here before. Melania Trump has been in the White House and has occupied that role. And I wonder she's at the end of this next term, she will have been first lady for longer than Jill Biden was. She will have more experience, but I just wonder what their conversations are like too, in terms of what they hope to accomplish or what Melania is thinking about in this next 4 years.
And Melania recently told Fox that it's easier this time around. She's lived there. She knows what the space is like. She knows what they want. She knows which furniture they want to bring in. The incoming first family gets to redecorate the residence with things pulled from White House stocks and bring things from home that are sentimental or what have you. And she said, since we've been here, and I know what it looks like, we were kind of coming in blind last time, although Michelle Obama did invite her into the residence and gave her the tour 8 years ago. Again, a courtesy that Melania Trump did not extend Jill Biden 4 years ago. But she didn't need that this time. And in fact, she skipped Donald Trump's visit here after the election. She knew what it was about, and she knew what she was getting into, and she seemed visibly more comfortable in this interview with the prospect of, moving away from Trump Tower and moving away from these big gilded residences that they have in Florida and elsewhere, and moving into the White House. And taking pains to note that Barron Trump will have a bedroom in the White House for when he comes home to visit from college. He's not the little kid he was during the first Trump administration. He's now about, I think, taller than his father. Now it's a little bit jarring to see, frankly.
He has definitely grown up and attending colleges in New York City. Now we see Vice President Kamala Harris and incoming Vice President J.D. Vance making their exit. Let's listen in as they depart for the U.S. Capitol.
Thank you, sir.
So there's just one pair left in terms of who we anticipate to be departing the White House and heading to the U.S. Capitol. That will be President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump, who will be getting into what you see there, that limousine that's pulling up here at the north portico of the White House to take them to the U.S. Capitol for Donald Trump's second inauguration.
President Biden confirmed as President-elect Trump arrived this morning that he did in fact continue a tradition dating back to Ronald Reagan, now in 1989, of leaving his successor a handwritten note inside the Oval Office. There had been a little bit of question about whether that was going to happen. Donald Trump left Joe Biden a note. Remember, he did not concede the race, still has not conceded it, but he did leave Joe Biden a note. President Biden has refused to divulge what was in that, except he called it shockingly gracious. And Trump himself said that he spent a few days mulling over what to put in it. So President Biden's not saying what is in the note, but he is now the first president to receive a note from the person for whom he then had to write a note. We're full of presidential history and tidbits today, and that's
absolutely. It's just one of those circumstances.
That's another one that wasn't on the list for this morning, but there it is.
Thank you for that. I guess I'm just a nerd, but I do really enjoy learning more about this presidential history. And this is one of those days where we all kind of get good reminders of a lot of different inauguration-related tidbits, particularly. So much rich history here.
We would note that when the Trumps arrived, President Biden made it a point to say, "Welcome home," to Donald Trump as they approached. So I think the facial expressions will tell us something when they walk out those doors. A lot of smiles and handshakes on the way in, and now the reality of making that final walk out that door and that trip to Capitol Hill.
It is kind of interesting to think about this in the context of what we just saw a few weeks ago with former President Jimmy Carter's funeral, where we had the current president and several former presidents and their wives in attendance, seated together, greeting each other kind of backstage before they all came out. And there's always a lot of armchair quarterbacking in terms of trying to figure out exactly what the mechanics are and if any of these folks get along. But as we know, there is the ex-president's club, where only someone who has been through the mechanics of this job really understands other aspects of it. And I think that's something that's important to remember when we have these moments. There are a lot of political disagreements, certainly over a variety of different issues, but it is a select few people who really have been there and understand the gravity of the office.
And it's what America wants to put on display every 4 years, right? January 20th is the day to show the world, yes, this campaign was bitter. It was nasty. You and I were out there enough and heard these speeches. But when it comes time and the election happens, more often than not, the loser says, you know what, I lost. And the people made their choice. Now we move ahead. Now you make the change.
And here we see these doors opening again, where President Joe Biden and President-elect Donald Trump are exiting the Capitol. They're preceded by Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat from Minnesota. Let's listen in as they leave the White House. We're seeing Joe Biden and Donald Trump pulling away from the White House. Again, this is Joe Biden's last time exiting the White House as the President of the United States, and the last time that Donald Trump will make that same trip until he is president later on this afternoon. They're making their way over to the U.S. Capitol now. And as they make that relatively short trip, Sagar, I thought we could talk a little bit about some inauguration history. Clearly, America has been swearing presidents into office since 1789, but it hasn't always happened in Washington. Where was George Washington first sworn in?
Yeah,
where did that take place?
It didn't happen until 1801 here in Washington, because in 1789, New York City was the U.S. Capitol. So George Washington had to go all the way from Mount Vernon in Virginia, get all the way up to New York City in bad weather. And so the swearing in didn't happen until, well, it then used to be March 4th was the date. It didn't happen until April 30th. And so George Washington took the oath of office there. I walk on untrodden ground was one of the lines that he uttered. 4 years later, he took it in Philadelphia, which, again, at the time was the capital. It wasn't until Thomas Jefferson that the first oath was taken here. It has been taken here every time since, whether that was in the Capitol, whether the oath was in the White House, like Ronald Reagan was forced to take it 40 years ago. You had the exceptions due to tragedy. You had Lyndon Johnson take the oath aboard Air Force One on the tarmac at Love Field in Dallas after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Calvin Coolidge, the vice president, was at his family farm in Vermont. No running water, no power. Warren Harding dies. A courier had to be sent to the Coolidge farm to tell the vice president that he was now the president. His father was a notary public.
Oh, convenient.
And standing in the family farmhouse with a kerosene lamp, gave his son the oath of office. Calvin Coolidge, of course, returned to Washington to then do that. But it's taken a few different forms over the years, but the oath stays the same. For now on, the date stays the same. And everything else is just kind of part of the fabric of Washington.
That's fascinating. We're seeing the motorcade now make that turn onto Pennsylvania Avenue as they proceed from the White House down to the U.S. Capitol. At the Capitol, we've seen various dignitaries making their way into the rotunda. We've had former speakers of the U.S. House and others who are getting into what is a relatively small space, all things considered, for an entire swearing-in ceremony to be happening. Ordinarily, we'd be out on the west front of the U.S. Capitol, but due to weather, everything is moved inside the Capitol Rotunda, where there are a number of seats arranged, but there's really only space for a small fraction of who would ordinarily be watching this all take place out of doors on the west front of the Capitol.
We've alluded to it so many times, but it's just so odd, having been in Washington for so long, to look at these streets and there are basically police officers and a few tourists and what look to be perhaps some construction workers. That's it. I mean, we would ordinarily have tens of thousands of people lining this route to get a look at that. And we've been in a lot of motorcades. That's quite a motorcade, even for Washington. With that look, heading up toward the United States Capitol, decked out in flags, and you can see those flags lining the street to give you a sense of just how cold it is here in Washington. That's the wind whipping those flags.
And we saw the wind so intense there at the White House on the North Portico that I saw one of the flags kind of knock one of the Marines' caps backwards when they were holding the doors open for everyone. And it is extremely cold, but also blustery out there. So I'm glad you and I are inside.
Yeah, I think we've spent enough time outside for these events to appreciate being inside. But again, that's what has upended years of planning and kind of sent the district into a bit of a tailspin trying to figure out security and again the ticketing at Capital One Arena. 250,000 people had tickets to watch this happen from the Capitol grounds. That arena sits 20,000. The math is not very good.
No, and all those tickets now are considered to be commemorative tickets because they didn't get you access to the Capital One Arena if you had one of those Capitol tickets initially. And I'm sure there are a lot of disappointed people who had come to town hoping to get that viewpoint, but there is the event at Capital One Arena. I'm sure that there are a lot of places around Washington where folks have gathered to watch what is history. Regardless of party, it is still a historic moment to watch a new president taking the oath, and it will look different. I mean, this hasn't happened from inside the rotunda in 40 years, so a lot of people who would have been paying attention to all the coverage today maybe weren't so much 40 years ago. So that it'll look different, but it's still part of history.
As we said, 600 people fit inside the rotunda. So, for example, the only former lawmakers that have been allowed inside, physically allowed inside the rotunda, are 3 former Republican House speakers. Newt Gingrich is there, John Boehner is there, Kevin McCarthy, not a good Trump ally, but he is there. And the House came into session this morning, quickly recessed so that members could make their way over, but that traditional roster of so many folks is not going to be in place this time. Though we do know that a lot of these tech billionaires that Donald Trump has allied himself with, who have flocked to Washington, not just today, but in the weeks since the inauguration, have also scored some prime seating near where the president-elect will take his oath.
It's always important in these sorts of circumstances to look and see who is in there and then try to telegraph as much as we can what that signifies. And I think we already know in the incoming Trump administration the sort of relationships that he has been working to build with some of those that we're going to be seeing in there. The motorcade is now going to be approaching the U.S. Capitol, where we will see all the people who just loaded up at the White House, then arriving at the Capitol for, in about an hour, we will be seeing that swearing in take place for Donald Trump. Again, there on your screen, you see the U.S. helicopter. It would be Marine One when a president is on board, but otherwise, that is what Joe Biden will be boarding after Donald Trump is inaugurated. That is what will take then the former president and former first lady off to Joint Base Andrews, where they will begin a trip out to California, purportedly a vacation, an opportunity to kind of reset after their time in the White House has concluded. But for the next hour and change, Joe Biden will still be president, and he will be arriving here at the U.S. Capitol with the incoming president, President-elect Donald Trump, who has been part of this motorcade for the last couple of minutes, coming from the White House. Down there is that shot you see of Pennsylvania Avenue leading up to the U.S. Capitol. Not outside, but inside. He will soon be inaugurated for his second term in office. Here we see some of those shots of the motorcade as they make their way up to the area where all of the parties will be getting out of their limousines and walking into the Capitol.
Awaiting them in the rotunda already, you have Congress's top officials. You have House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican, who has very closely allied himself with the incoming president, saying to him, it's bright, sunny outside and bright in our heart. Then you have the Senate's top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, who walked in carrying a royal blue cap, and when asked how he feels today, said, feel great about the Bills. Now, that comes after the Buffalo Bills. Schumer, of course, from New York, beat the Baltimore Ravens last night to advance to the AFC Championship. So it was a way for Chuck Schumer to get in a plug for a home state team on the day after a big NFL playoff weekend.
We see these arrivals starting to happen there at the U.S. Capitol. We understand there were some other officials there in the motorcade with the president and president-elect as they were making their way into the U.S. Capitol. Amy Klobuchar, the senator, as we just referenced earlier, but also some other elected officials, including Deb Fischer of Nebraska, and then also House lawmakers, Steve Scalise, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, and other White House staff and officials accompanying the president, first lady, incoming president and first lady, and then, of course, Vice President Kamala Harris, her husband, and J.D. Vance and his wife. Just got. We just saw J.D. Vance and Usha Vance exiting their limousine, walking into the White House or to the U.S. Capitol.
You see even police officers who are used to this kind of thing in Washington want to get their picture taken in front of the helicopter. That's quite a shot for that officer to have. Marine One sitting in front of the Capitol dome.
Not something you see all the time.
No. And you would note the flags. That one flag you can see flying in front of the Capitol dome back up at full staff after they had been lowered for the Jimmy Carter morning.
We see now people from that motorcade have been making their way into the Capitol. That includes President-elect Donald Trump. We're looking now inside the Capitol Rotunda. There you see Elon Musk, one of those businessmen who are invited to be part of this very small, relatively speaking, swearing-in ceremony. There's Melania Trump. Second gentleman, Doug Emhoff.
Good morning, Mr. Vice President. How do you feel?
There's J.D. Vance and his wife, Usha. And we talked about this Capitol Rotunda really not having a lot of extra space, Sagar, for even those former lawmakers that we would usually anticipate being there for an event like this. But when we see these images and really just kind of note how close together everyone is, there is just not extra room to get maybe even one or two more people aside from what they've been able to plan for. It's a different kind of situation, but
shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah,
and you
pretty
can
much.
see in the front in that shot the current members of the Senate kind of crammed together. You had Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, next to John Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming, who was next to Dick Durbin, the number 2 Senate Democrat from Illinois, all kind of clustered very close together here. Talked earlier about Brett Kavanaugh being the one who will administer the oath to J.D. Vance. Vance is only 40. Be the not the youngest vice president, but one of them. There was a 36-year-old vice president, but that was back in James Buchanan's administration in the late 50s. But there have been others in their 40s, Al Gore, Teddy Roosevelt, but breaking with a bit of precedent here. A fairly young J.D. Vance set to take the oath of office, followed, of course, by the oldest man to take the oath as president in Donald Trump.
We're seeing now some members of the incoming Trump administration walking into the rotunda. Clearly, those confirmation hearings for a number of positions have been ongoing in the Senate for at least a week, a little over, and we anticipate those to resume again tomorrow. There have not been official votes, but there will be some more open hearings as well as some business meetings and markups of some of the committee work before a lot of those nominations proceed to the full Senate for their vote.
You had Kevin Hassett, who was looking to come back as the Trump White House's top economist after serving in that role in the first Trump administration. Tulsi Gabbard, who would be the national intelligence chief, Pam Bondi, Doug Burgum, all lined up there to watch the man they hope is their boss to be taking the oath.
Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff.
It used to be fun at these outdoor events on the West Front to look around it again. You'd see the justices of the Supreme Court sitting together. You'd see the Joint Chiefs, the nation's top military officers, sitting together and taking a look out at the crowd. In fact, we just got a look at General C.Q. Brown, who is the now outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's top military officer. Former Vice President Dan Quayle and Marilyn Quayle making their way inside the rotunda. We don't get a lot of Dan Quayle sightings in Washington lately, but that's now 2 in 2 weeks after he was here for Jimmy Carter's funeral.
Indeed.
We talk about young vice presidents like J.D. Vance. Dan Quayle, basically an unknown congressman when George H.W. Bush tapped him to be vice president in 1989.
It is rare to get all of these officials together in the same space, but I think there have been a lot of remarks lately about how that does happen at inaugurations and funerals, and we have had 2 of those at close proximity here in Washington in recent weeks.
It is reassuring, frankly, isn't it, for those of us who spend so much time covering the division here in Washington and the rancor to see these people sit next to each other, to chat with them, to do what George W. Bush did at the Carter funeral and literally tap Barack Obama on the belly as he walked by.
Former Vice President Mike Pence coming in. Clearly he was vice president in Trump's first administration. Now joining the dignitaries who are in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda.
See a lot of Elon Musk today. He will be speaking at the parade of sorts inside Capital One Arena later today. Has been almost a constant by the president-elect's side since the last time you and I were in this room in November for the election.
And up until then, he had stumped so heavily for Trump on the campaign trail, particularly in Pennsylvania, which was one of those major areas of focus. But yes, was part of the events at Capital One Arena last night with his son X, who actually joined him on stage with Donald Trump and didn't make his own remarks, but certainly was part of his father's remarks. But now we see Musk there again in the Capitol Rotunda and will be the incoming head of the Department of Government Efficiency, not an official government agency, but intended to cut costs throughout the government, something that Donald Trump has asked Elon Musk to be in charge of. So we will see what that agency or what that department accomplishes.
A new agency to cut back on the other agencies. With Vivek Ramaswamy, who we saw earlier, he's there somewhere. There's nowhere really to hide in the rotunda.
No, we'll see him pop back up. Not a lot of space.
It looks a lot bigger when you're in there and there aren't 600 people.
It does. There's Robert F. Kennedy Jr., again appointed by Trump to head the Department of Health and Human Services, yet to have a hearing on Capitol Hill, although that is anticipated to be among some of the more contentious confirmation hearings that could be happening for this administration.
Now, the other side of that shot, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State designate, who did testify last week, and another tech titan, Jeff Bezos. We talked earlier about what's in the Constitution about the inauguration. There's nothing about a parade, there's nothing about balls, there's nothing about how you get to and from the Capitol. It's the date and it's the oath. That's it. Everything else has kind of evolved organically. In this case, evolved due to the weather. But all it prescribes is that by noon, that oath has to be taken. We are just over an hour away from that and should be approximately 55 minutes, let's say, from Donald Trump reciting those 35 words for a second time.
Former President Bill Clinton and former First Lady and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton coming into the rotunda.
Hillary Clinton said watching Donald Trump take the oath 8 years ago after he beat her in that election was one of the hardest days of her life, but she felt a duty to be there and again to be here today with her husband, the former president.
Former President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush.
We lamented that the indoors are going to rob us of one of the great visuals from inaugurations past. George W. Bush sitting there in his
clear poncho.
Yeah, almost looked to be a homemade rain cover of sorts.
Yeah, with this being inside, we really don't get to see that winter weather gear, unfortunately. There's former President Barack Obama also coming in. Without former First Lady Michelle Obama, who notably said that she would not be attending this inauguration. Also did not attend Jimmy Carter's funeral here in Washington a few weeks ago.
Obama's office did not say why the former First Lady would not be here today. They did say she had a prior engagement during the Carter funeral, but again, pointedly did not offer a reason for her absence today.
We're still taking a look inside the Capitol Rotunda there on the left-hand side, but on the right, that is again the Capital One Arena where Donald Trump, after he is inaugurated, will be making his way in what would be the inaugural parade is now subbed in for an indoor event there at Capital One Arena here in Washington. People have been gathering there for hours, and they will be still waiting for some hours before the new president arrives, but these are a lot of his strong supporters, and assuredly they will still be there by the time he shows up.
And as they watched the images from the rotunda on the big screen inside the arena, some boos